Do you have a fabric stash? Well, if you are somewhat like me, you have one and usually don't use any of those fabrics. Often they just don't quite fit the project at hand. But I made it a point to use some of the fabrics I own and make some garments out of it, before I allow myself to buy something new. The problem is that most of the fabrics I own are swatches. Some have decent size, but most are less than a square meter big. They were made during my internships as a textile designer and usually they are thrown away after a collection is finished. Some of the swatches were gifted to me so that they wouldn't end up in the trash, but since then I've never came around using them. So here we are with a fabric of 1.4 meter by 1.6 meter and my idea to make a Victorian or Edwardian working skirt out of it. With the additional restriction of having as few sewing lines as possible, so I won't disrupt the pattern too much. Sounds somewhat impossible, right? Well, it felt like it is. Since no pattern seemed to fit onto the fabric, the hem was just way too wide at all patterns I already had printed. So I went on and searched the book Authentic Victorian Fashion Patterns for a skirt pattern, which fulfills my requirements. And I actually found one. The description says that it is a pattern from 1893, and I like the sketch which goes along with the pattern. The pattern had a width of 153 centimeter and therefore I thought I have with 140 centimeter width just a little less gathering at the waist as required. Turned out I was wrong, but more on that later. First I started cutting the fabric into two pieces with a slight dip on the front of the waist, so that the skirt is a little shorter at the front than at the back. This way I used almost the entire fabric and together with a big pocket and the waistband I had no material left. First I marked a few points of the pattern on the fabric and then cut those pieces out. The pattern basically consists of the front of the skirt, the back of the skirt, a pocket and the underlap. Then I sewed the pocket together. I finally found some tarlatan and added it to the inside of the hem with a little patching, since the tarlatan is not as wide as the main fabric. I basically sewed those two pieces of tarlatan with a running stitch together, which is quite loose but still holds it in place. Then I basted the tarlatan onto the main fabric so that it won't move while I sew the lining onto it. Then I covered it with a white popeline so the scratchy tarlatan would be covered. This lining or popeline I also basted into place before I sewed it on. Unfortunately, I realized once it was sewn in that the main fabric is somewhat transparent and the white lining is visible. I didn't like the optic of this and decided to take the partial lining out again and line the entire skirt. This time with a white voile, since it is lightweight in comparison to the popeline. It is really astonishing to me how a work of 6 hours can be undone in barely 5 minutes. I haven't figured out yet if that is an advantage, since remaking something where the undoing would take also 5 hours or so seems really nerve-wracking. I continued with sewing on the tarlatan to the main fabric with a stitch that isn't visible at the front
and then basted the entire lining onto the main fabric, covering the tarlatan. This way everything stays in place securely.
After basting the lining to the main fabric, I sewed the two pieces together.
First I basted the side seams together with a wide running stitch and then sewed it with the sewing machine. I really got used to my old iron Mamsell and I barely use my modern sewing machine anymore. Then I prepared the underlap with sewing it together, cutting the edges and basically blocking it into shape. Then I basted it into place again and afterwards sewed it on with the sewing machine. Once this was done, I continued with the pocket and sewed it together with the princess seam. Then I ironed the seam lines open and flat and also blocked it. I had completely forgotten that the pocket needed an opening, so I had to reopen it and set in the pocket. Then I continued felling down the seam allowance and also sewing in the pockets in this step. Then I lined the waistband and
secured the seam allowance of the waistline. I know that antique garments were sometimes not finished, but the fabrics were woven way denser since the shuttle weaving machines used can push the yarns tightly together and the modern airjet or rapier looms are not able to do so. Therefore were the fabrics back then less prone to fraying, while my fabric is fraying quite badly. With the seam allowance secured, I gathered the waist with two seam lines with fairly wide stitches,
which I then pulled in.
And this was the moment I got really confused, since the material would just not fit into the waistband. Even with the tightest gathering, it wasn't possible. So I went back to read the pattern description again, and one particular part I have apparently ignored. Quote, "The skirt is drafted by the waist measure, is in one piece." I honestly don't understand it, since then the width would have been half of the one I used, and I wouldn't be able to walk in such a tubular and restricting skirt. So probably I'm missing the necessary information or how to use the patterns properly, but it wouldn't help in my current situation anymore. So I decided to take the excess material and fold it in a big double box pleat at the back and try to distribute the gathering at the front with a little less material. I was still wondering about the instructions and I found another skirt with the exact same measurements but a slightly different sketch, and this one corresponds more with the actual product I got.
I sewed on the waistband with the sewing machine. I was quite surprised that the gathering wasn't that problematic with the sewing machine. In fact, it was easier than doing it by hand. Even the big box pleat was no problem. Then I cut the hem even because some parts were a little bit too long.
I went on and hemmed the skirt. I made sure to just pick up the lining so that the seam would not be visible on the front. And the skirt was finished. I'm still not sure if I like that much gathering at the waistline, and the train seems somewhat long, since I have already destroyed the hem by wearing it once. So I bought a brush bit despite the fact that the color doesn't entirely match the skirt. Nevertheless,
I secured it with a quick and dirty basting stitch
so that I can take it off once it is worn out. Hopefully it will protect the hem, otherwise I will have to shorten it.
So the skirt is finished, so it's proof you can make a Victorian walking skirt with less than 2 meters of fabric. Okay, main fabric, I didn't count the lining.
There is only one thing left. I will make a girdle to hide a little of the gathering at the waist. I want it more accentuated, just as it is done in the sketches, but this will be another project.